Some of Hollywood's most recognizable sitcom actors were selling comfort, charm, and familiarity every week on television. But off-screen, that image often came with limits. What makes these stories interesting is not just that parts of their lives stayed private. It is how the industry helped decide what kind of man could be visible, believable, and safe for the audience to accept. 1. Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson is probably the clearest example of how old Hollywood didn't just sell stars, it managed them. By the 1950s, studios were not only choosing roles and publicity photos, they were shaping what kind of man the audience was allowed to see. With Hudson, that image was very specific: tall, handsome, calm, unmistakably romantic. He looked like certainty. What makes his story worth talking about now is not just that he was hiding part of his private life, it's that the industry already knew how valuable that silence was. His marriage to Phyllis Gates is still debated in terms of motive and control, but at minimum, it fit the logic of the era. If a male star's image looked vulnerable, the system moved quickly to stabilize it. That matters more than gossip. Hudson's case shows how Hollywood treated identity as something that could be edited, packaged, and defended like any other part of a career. 2. Liberace. With Liberace, the interesting part is not that people speculated. It's that he built an entire career in plain sight while still refusing to let the public name what they were looking at. The fur coats, the jewelry, the grand entrances, the candelabra on the piano. None of that was subtle. But mid-century entertainment had a strange rule. Flamboyance was acceptable as long as it stayed inside performance. Once it crossed into identity, the tone changed. That is why the legal side of his story matters. When he sued the Daily Mirror over an article implying he was gay, he was not just protecting his reputation, he was defending the boundary that made his fame possible. The public could enjoy the spectacle, but the official story had to remain intact. That contradiction is what makes Liberace more than a celebrity anecdote. He showed how entertainment culture could profit from coded visibility while still punishing open acknowledgement. 3. Raymond Burr. Raymond Burr did not just avoid questions about his private life. He seems to have built an entirely different personal history around himself, and that is what makes his case stand out. In public, he spoke about wives, loss, and family tragedy in ways that made him sound settled, even wounded. Later reporting called much of that story into question. If those accounts are accurate, then Burr was not simply being discreet. He was constructing cover. That detail says a lot about the period he worked in. Burr played men who projected authority and control, and television rewarded that image. A figure like Perry Mason was not supposed to feel socially ambiguous. Robert Benavides, who was his longtime partner, could remain beside him for years, but only in a form the public could safely accept. What stays interesting here is not the fact of secrecy by itself. It is how completely Hollywood encouraged people to treat a believable fiction as more acceptable than a truthful life. 4. Jim Nabors. Jim Nabors does not fit the usual Hollywood pattern of scandal, exposure, or public unraveling, and that is exactly why he belongs in this list. His story is quieter than that. He became famous playing Gomer Pyle, a character so closely tied to innocence and small-town decency that the image followed him off-screen too. In that television world, being liked was not enough. You also had to feel safe to the audience. What stands out is how long his real life could exist in full view of the people closest to him and still remain officially unspoken. Nabors spent decades with Stan Cadwallader before they married in 2013, when Nabors was in his 80s. There was no dramatic reveal there, just a fact that had been waiting for the culture and the law to catch up. That is what makes his story worth pausing on. Sometimes Hollywood secrecy was not about inventing a double life. Sometimes it was about being forced to postpone ordinary recognition for most of a lifetime. 5. Merv Griffin. Merv Griffin's case is less dramatic on the surface, which is part of why it is useful. He was not mainly selling himself as a romantic leading man, and he was not cornered into one defining public scandal. He was a host, a producer, and eventually a television power center. That gave him something the others on this list did not always have in the same way: control over the room. That changes how secrecy works. With Griffin, the question is not simply whether rumors existed. They did. The more interesting point is how effectively he managed distance. He had the polished answers, the social ease, and the kind of professional authority that let him redirect attention before it settled anywhere uncomfortable. Even after his death, public discussion about his sexuality stayed oddly hesitant, which says a lot on its own. Griffin's story shows that in Hollywood, privacy was not only about fear. Sometimes it was also about power, specifically the power to decide what remained visible and what never became fully public at all. And that is really the point. These stories are not just about private lives. They show how much of Hollywood was built on deciding which version of a person the public was allowed to see.